Hello, History 365. So today, our second to last lecture, I'm just going to be talking a bit about the intensification of warfare that we see in Europe, particularly during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, that does lead to the creation of, for better or worse, European modernity. I think there's, we obviously have seen intensive periods of warfare in medieval Europe, say, for example, the 100 Years' War, fundamentally a dynastic war fought about who's going to control the throne of France, and also matters of territory included. But there is a new cultural factor in the 16th century that leads to an extraordinary amount of intensive military violence in Europe, and that is religion. This goes to our big theme of war and culture, and people fighting wars over motives that are primarily cultural. And the key sort of turning point is 1517, when Martin Luther famously pounds his 95 Theses onto the cathedral at Wittenberg, and this ultimately sparks the Protestant Reformation. There's subsequently a Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, but this leads to divisions within Europe and within individual states and societies between Protestants and Catholics, and these people are willing to fight over these deeply held religious views that, probably from the perspective of many Americans who may identify as Methodist or Presbyterian or Catholic or no religion, seem tiny. These may range from the kind of garb that priests should wear, to the nature of the Eucharist, to the form of church organization, whether you should be led by a pope or a bishop or a board of elders, or even just should the congregation itself govern yourself. These are all issues that at various points spark violence. And so we're going to see a huge, significant sort of wave of religious violence, including in France from the 1560s into the 1590s, which range from, again, kind of murder, mob violence, say, for example, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and ends with full-on dynastic wars that brings about the accession, say, of Henry IV, a Protestant leader who, for the sake of peace, converts to Catholicism and then issues a kind of edict of mutual, if grudging, toleration. The most brutal of these religious wars is going to be in the Holy Roman Empire. There are a number of German states, principalities within the Holy Roman Empire that have always been sort of semi-autonomous, and now some of these become Protestant, some of these stay Catholic. The emperors, the Holy Roman emperors themselves, stay Catholic, and from 1618 to 1648, there is a just brutal war between Protestant factions within the Holy Roman Empire and Catholic factions who are then supported by the imperial troops themselves. So this is a brutal civil war within Germany. It is a war that also sees outside interference. The Spanish on behalf of the Catholics, and the Swedish and French on behalf of the Protestants. So a brutal war that makes Germany in the from 1680 to 1648 probably one of the most awful places to live in perhaps all of human history. It's probably up there in the top 10. And even after this, we have a civil war in England that is fundamentally about religion. Briefly even sees the king overthrown and executed, Charles I, and England ruled by essentially a Presbyterian dictatorship until a monarchy is restored. So again, I can't go into the detail of every single religious war, but religion and the Reformation and Counter-Reformation leads to extraordinary religious passions that prompt a tremendous amount of violence. And of course, again, religious wars are difficult. More secular historians, particularly in the 20th century, were oftentimes inclined to say, well, yeah, they say they're fighting about religion, but they're probably deep down fighting about land or sovereignty or things of that nature. There was a tendency not to take the religious motives behind this kind of warfare seriously. But it seems that many people, both from high-ranking political and ecclesiastical leaders all the way down to even, in some instances, common soldiers, very strongly feel that they are fighting for their particular religious vision. So the Protestant Reformation is going to spawn a huge amount of violence. And, as Antonio Andrade notes in his book, the fact that we have many different states engaging in intensive warfare is going to be a factor that's going to drive a lot of military innovations through what political scientists call a challenge and response sort of view of innovation. If there's a lot of different players, if one of them comes up with a better musket, everyone's going to try to adopt that better musket best they can. And this doesn't just apply necessarily to weapons, it can apply to tactics, something we've certainly talked about. It can apply to other sort of supporting military technologies. So, for example, there is the need to develop high-quality glass for optics. That is going to be a technology that nations compete. And ultimately, actually, the Prussians are famous for having really, really high-quality glass for things like telescopes that certainly have an important military application. And it's also going to even include challenge and response innovations in even the basic apparatus of the state, including the development of bureaucracies. And one thing that happens is European states themselves become much more robust. And this itself is a bit of requires the competition and warfare, but it also can be kind of a self-fulfilling process, a virtuous cycle, in that states are fighting wars in order to capitalize those wars. And of course, we've talked about how these technological developments make warfare more capitally intensive. And it can be capitally intensive because of the expense of building huge warships that can carry, 100 cannon, the forging of cannons themselves, maintaining supplies of munitions, building much larger and more intensive fortifications that can endure gunpowder and bombardment, and even the fact that as you can equip more and more soldiers with muskets, you actually now start to need bigger and bigger armies. And so those armies now need to be paid and supplied. So the capital required for warfare requires states to develop institutions that can raise money internally. And so these are bureaucracies. These are improving the efficiency of tax collection. We actually see states really for the first time truly defining borders, not just in certain states that long had a sense of, okay, we end where that river is, and that's where the other state begins. But in actually sealing and controlling those boundaries, setting up custom houses, border patrols, things of that nature, in part because they need to actually maximize the revenues that they can collect from customs and tolls, so that they can support larger and more capitally intensive armies. The famous fiscal historian Charles Tilley sort of sums it up in a very pithy statement, in that states made war and war made the state. That is, as states need more resources to mobilize more resources, they themselves become more intensive, and in many ways more state-like. And again, the sort of increasing definition of boundaries is one way in which European states are becoming much more state-like during this period. So now, mentioning capital, one other feature of European warfare in this period, and this is, I think, certainly something that may start to set Europe apart, even from sophisticated war making that we see in China, is there is now an incredible new source of capital that is open to the Atlantic powers, and that is the New World. Now, the first power that's really capable of capitalizing on this is Spain, which gets there first because Christopher Columbus sails under a Spanish flag. The early conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, are Spanish. And so the Spanish are able to start to exploit Spain. And the first major form of exploitation that really works for the Spanish is silver. Treating Mexico in particular, and also Peru, as simply grand overseas silver mines using natives as slave labor to extract silver. And huge inflows of silver initially allow Spanish armies, the dynasty that controls both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, to be the most powerful, well-equipped, and dangerous in Europe. Now, it does seem to, after a while, they run into a problem. They've got this nice flow of capital that comes in. They can pay to mobilize soldiers. They can fight wars, but then those wars ultimately cause capital outflows. So, in some ways, the capital flows through Spain, but ultimately goes to others, including actually the plucky rivals of the Spanish, the Dutch, who, as merchants, are able to mobilize capital in a different way through their sort of productivity as traders, but they also mobilize it militarily, so that by the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch have one of the best navies in Europe and give the English a run for their money on the high seas. Now, different European states ultimately exploit the New World in different ways, as you may have learned, say, in your high school AP U.S. history class, with the Spanish in exploiting South America. Again, the initial big exploitation was silver. The British start off in North America quite slowly, but are engaging in tremendous, particularly in the Caribbean, especially Barbados, are engaging in plantation-style agriculture and are importing huge numbers of African slaves. And of course, one reason why African slaves are used actually comes into the issue we've had with guns, germs, and steel. European germs will kill Native Americans who have no, not have millennia of exposure to them, but the sort of germ pool for Africa and Eurasia is somewhat the same. So that means Africans imported as slaves are not as susceptible to things like smallpox, and that's one reason, it's not the only reason, why African slaves are used. And indeed, the colonization of the New World is fundamentally an African project. We oftentimes treat it as a European project, but person per person, there are more Africans involved in New World colonization than there are Europeans. Enslaved Africans, and this is actually something as we're writing new histories of capitalism, enslaved Africans also underwrite, literally, many of the capitalist institutions in Britain. So, for example, when Britain is developing its banking industry, what's a big element in the ledger of early British banks? Slaves. When Britain is developing its insurance industry, what are they insuring? Slaves. And this is important, actually. It's important from the point of view of a military history, is that Britain starts pulling away from the rest of Europe in terms of its sort of intensity of its economy, some changes to its political system that make it probably the most, for want of a better word, sort of democratic state. So it has a monarchy, but after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, it's the most sort of liberal state in Europe in terms of the amount of popular representation, still low by modern standards. It also has more capitalist mechanisms than other states, again, in terms of things like banks and insurance agencies, again, largely underwritten by New World slavery. And by the middle of the 1750s, it has new types of industry, new types of technological innovations that are nursed along by these other capitalist institutions. You can get capital from banks to start a loom or a mill is quite important. But this ultimately starts to have military implications in that it allows Britain eventually to kind of pull away militarily, not because it has bigger armies. The British army is never very big compared to, say, the French army or even some of the armies that can be raised in Germany. It, however, is more capitalized, in part because of the greater sophistication of European capital, so they can do things like have an extraordinarily large navy that can project power across the Atlantic and even into the Pacific. And indeed, in some ways, our story, which technically ends with the French Revolution, nonetheless sees Britain quickly emerging as the most modern of all of the European states. And that will certainly have military implications. Now, one final thing. Now, after the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia is actually set up to try to discourage further religious wars. It simply says, hey, whatever is in your state, if you're Catholic, if you're Lutheran, if you're Calvinist, fine. Outside powers won't try to interfere with your internal religion. Now, there is actually going to still be a religious civil war raging in England into the 1660s. But warfare in the late 17th and into the 18th century is much more secular in nature. The things that are being fought about are more things like dynastic succession. We get things like the War of Austrian Succession, the War of Spanish Succession. They're fought over land, both minor exchanges of frontier territory in Europe. And here's where actually the New World becomes important, particularly by the 18th century, as something that powers are fighting over in terms of huge tracts of land being exchanged. The biggest exchange initially coming in the 7 Years' War, where huge amounts of what had been Upper Canada are controlled by the French, subsequently go to the British. This is what we would today call the Ohio Valley and Upper Midwest. And then another huge transition of territory during the so-called American War, which is fought between France and Britain between 1778 and 1783. We know this as the American Revolution, but in many ways this is one of a series of wars between France and Britain with other European powers aligning in the 18th century that are fought partially in the New World. So we do see this continued intensification of warfare that, again, through this challenge and response model, gives us many of the sort of rapid developments that we're seeing. Technological developments, tactical developments, institutional developments, economic developments. But this means that by the time we get to the 18th century, towards the end of our course, European states are radically different from what European states had looked like, before the gunpowder age. Weak, feudal, decentralized. Instead, we have centralized states, increasingly using sophisticated bureaucracies, maintaining large armies, exerting more intensive and at times rational control over territories, and they're doing that in order to maintain that virtuous cycle of extraction and control, raising taxes to fund armies, and then spending those taxes on arms. They are becoming more efficient military tributary complexes. So again, this is happening across the end of our period. What we will do on Monday, I will have kind of one final reflection, which is when should this course end, or when should it have ended? And we'll think about continuity and discontinuity in terms of European warfare during the early modern age. So see you then.